To welcome you to today's very special event and introduce the moderator of today's event, who will be introducing in turn our distinguished panelists. Dr. Zehra Hashmi is a postdoctoral fellow in international and public affairs here at Brown University. She is an anthropologist and historian who works on identification technologies in South Asia. Dr. Hashmi's research explores the everyday workings of securitization and surveillance at the intersection of identification, migration, kinship, and post-colonial and colonial governance practices. She received her PhD from the Interdepartmental Program in Anthropology and History at the University of Michigan and her Bachelor's of Arts from Columbia University. She's currently working on a book about the history, politics, and technology of national identification practices in Pakistan. Without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Zehra Hashmi, who will serve as MC for today's event.
Thank you so much, Faiz, for that introduction. I'll move right along. I'll first be introducing Dr. Abdel Tikriti. He has graciously joined us from London over Zoom today to share his thoughts on witness. He's particularly well suited for this. He's published widely on modern Palestinian history and specifically on the themes of anti-colonialism, revolution, state formation, and intellectual traditions. He is the inaugural Arab American Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Arab History and the founding director of the Arab American Educational Foundation Center for Arab Studies at the University of Houston. His book, Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, was a finalist for the Royal Historical Society's Gladstone Prize for the best debut book in non-British history. He's currently the 2022-23 incoming Mahmoud Darwish Visiting Professor in Palestinian Studies at Brown University. He should be showing up on Zoom.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the gracious introduction. And it's a great honor to be invited to this event. As somebody who's worked for a long time on Palestine, but also on the themes of anti-colonialism and counter-insurgency more broadly, I've always been fascinated by the interconnections between the questions of Kashmir, Palestine, and broader anti-colonial struggles. Now, first of all, I should note that when we speak of interconnections, we are not speaking of identical cases. No two cases of anti-colonial struggles are identical to begin with, but also the Palestinian question is quite different than that of Kashmir, despite the many similarities between them. They were both, of course, born in the same year. They both go back to a certain commitment to partition on the part of colonial powers. They both go back to 1947. They both share many dynamics that entail demographic engineering on the part of powerful states, that entail framing anti-colonial resistance as terrorism, and so on and so forth. However, of course, there are some major differences. The question of Palestine entailed the European settler colonial dimension that we do not find in Kashmir. However, the question of Kashmir poses to us some profound issues that have to do with the development of internal colonial policies on the part of post-colonial states. And it poses issues of minorities and majorities that are quite significant. It determines these questions determine how we view not only the situation in the past, but also how we envision the future in spaces like that. So, despite their differences, there is a set of there are a set of commonalities that have to be emphasized, and that's why I'm here today. And the most important of these is a legacy of struggle. What we have seen in Kashmir over the past few decades is the rise of popular movements that were contesting state hegemony. And we've seen also a total erasure of voice on the part of the people of Kashmir, which is quite similar to Palestine. Of course, the history of struggle in Palestine, at least the armed struggle, is a bit longer. But there's many themes to take into account that are quite similar. In the case of Kashmir, we've seen the same sort of erasure of voice and the erasure of image. And that's what's fascinating about the book that we're talking about today, which reminds me actually of earlier Palestinian efforts at producing similar books. In particular, I'm thinking of the collaboration between Edward Said and Jean Monnet, which produced Jean Moore, which produced, of course, a fascinating book called After the Last Sky. The attempt to integrate the image with text, the attempt to bring the people back through the image is a very important attempt in these settings, because what we have is not only an erasure of the image as it develops on the ground, but also a representation of an image that has nothing to do with what is going on the ground on the part of hegemonic authorities. So the effort that we witness in this book, an effort of, as the title suggests, it's an effort of witnessing. It's an engagement with different people who have witnessed and tried to communicate this act of witnessing to broader audiences. So that's a very important message that I see here. And it reminds me of the Palestinian quest to do the same. It is very difficult, and it's a difficult challenge to do that. There are narratives of erasure that are very powerful, that this book and other attempts to witness have to confront. There are discourses that are very powerful. I mean, I remember myself having to go through conversations with people as the situation in Kashmir was developing for the worse in the past few years, especially after the siege was imposed and after the total lockdown was imposed, and when people were really confronting a very repressive set of policies. At the height of these repressive policies, I had many conversations where there were serious academics trying to distort what was going on there. That's partly through blaming the situation on factors that matter, but that are not central to the policies that are being imposed. It's a series of examples. For example, to blame the feudal leaderships or local social struggles inside the province for the broader, inside the state, for the broader situation. To try to suggest that the hegemonic power is some technological miracle state that's trying to bring development against the resistance of people who are closed-minded and are still stuck in previous centuries. To engage in Islamophobic and Orientalist frameworks that do not entail any sort of acknowledgement of the demands of the people for basic dignity and for freedom. This sort of engagement, the attempt to produce a counter narrative through image and text that we see here is very powerful, and it is much needed, because these images show a different reality. They show a reality that really undermines the main claims of this counter-insurgency effort that is often framed as a war against terror or feudalism or religious fundamentalism and so on and so forth. They also belie the attempt to try to reduce this situation into a mere conflict that is geopolitical in nature, which is something that I'm very familiar with in the case of Palestine. For many years, the question of Palestine was distorted with reference to the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict. It just becomes a question of different states and interstate rivalry in the region, and the Palestinian people get lost in that. The question of the colonization of their land gets lost in that. The question of their serious determination to achieve independence, to achieve freedom, to achieve the return of refugees, to achieve a democratic future for both the native Palestinians and the settler colonizing Israelis gets completely distorted. We see this also in Kashmir. To reduce it, to reduce what is going on to a mere conflict with Pakistan, as is sometimes done, is to also erase the people on the ground, to erase the people of Kashmir and their legitimate demands. So I think a book of this sort and an engagement of this sort is very, very refreshing, precisely because it also adds a certain level of motion to what could be seen as the stillness of text. And I say this with a bit of irony because, of course, as we know, text moves, but the image looks still. However, I think what happens in the situations like this, where the people are so erased, to see the images of struggle, the images of the people, the images of the space, is to actually invigorate the imagination that has been so distorted by misframings that affect how we speak of these situations. There are indeed many differences between Kashmir and Palestine. However, when it comes to discursive strategies at erasure and discursive strategies that seek to frame what is going on, there are so many similarities. And I believe that this book is a very powerful counter to these rhetorical conceits that, at the end of the day, aim at shackling people rather than empowering them. So thank you for inviting me. I'd welcome any questions or engagements on this, and thanks.
Thank you so much to Dr. Tikriti for joining us. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us for much longer than this, as he had another engagement. So it's wonderful that we were able to have his comments and the really fruitful comparison and engagement from a Palestinian perspective. I'll now move to introducing the author, the editor of this book that is under discussion, Sanjay Kak, and he'll be presenting some of this work to us next. Sanjay Kak is a documentary filmmaker and a writer. His filmmaking work has spanned an incredible range of issues, from the Indian diaspora in the UK to the resistance against dams in India, to his recent feature-length documentary on the Maoist movement in India, Red Ant Dream. And the film that directly relates to what we'll be discussing today is, of course, Jashn-e-Azadi, How We Celebrate Freedom. Of course, Sanjay Kak is not only a wonderful filmmaker, but as we'll be discussing today, he's also worked on 2 books, the edited volumes Until My Freedom Has Come, The New Intifada in Kashmir, and Witness, the book under discussion, Kashmir 1986 to 2016, 9 photographers. Over to you.
Thank you. So thank you all for inviting me. Thank you to Brown for making it possible. This is a bit of a odd spectacle that we are faced with. I'm here to discuss a book, and it's a photo book. And how do you talk about a photo book without actually having it in your hands? But we'll try to get over that with some images that I'm going to show you. But I just wanted to say that there is a long tradition of photo books and a rich tradition of photo books globally. Obviously, in Kashmir, there hasn't been any, but this particular volume, sort of the physicality of it is a very important dimension of it. So those of you who've seen it, it comes tied in string. The string stays attached to it. It's a heavy book. You can't read it in a bus or a train easily. Things happen, things fold out, some things sometimes drop out of it, things fold out. So it's a tactile object, and that spectacle of the tactile is very much part of the story. So when I show you images from the book, that will only be one dimension. And I have a little 4-minute video which will give you a sense of the broader thing. This book, I'm a documentary filmmaker. That's what I've done most of my working life. And, there was a reference to this film, this long feature-length film that I made called Jashn-e-Azadi. And when I was researching for this film in, let's say, 2003, 2004, I ran into a bit of a dead end because I was trying to evoke the decade of the 1990s in Kashmir. And the 1990s, even by the standards of these last 30 years, were a particularly dark phase in Kashmir's history. First, the militancy arose, and then a very brutal counter-insurgency came up. And that the forms of that counter-insurgency were so brutal and sort of almost disemboweling of a society that it really is something that most people, the younger generation perhaps, have overcome it, but for an older generation, it's a period of trauma. So I used to try to get people to talk about it, and some people would speak, but there was a reluctance to come on camera to describe those experiences. And it's in that search for trying to evoke the 1990s that I began looking for video and also still photographs. And that's when I ran into the work of some of these photographers. And I was really taken aback at how these they were just ordinary photojournalists, and they had these in their private archives, so to speak, that how much those images said to me about that period, And I mean, somewhere in the back of my mind, I had this thought that someday something should be done with this, but of course one had no idea of what. Eventually, I located some quite astonishing video material which is used in the film, and these images receded until 2014, when Kashmir had a very, very major flood, and particularly the city of Srinagar large parts of it were under 10, 12 feet of water for like a week, 10 days. And several of my photographer friends during that period called up and said, can you speak to somebody? What do you do when negatives get soaked in flood water? Or I have hard disks that, got flooded out. What can we do? And I remember kind of shiver ran over me that, oh my God, imagine if these images just disappear. And serendipitously, the next year, the Prince Claus Foundation wrote to me and said, would you like to do a collaborative arts project? And I said, this is not collaborative, but it's a sort of curatorial project, but that's how the book came about. So that's about the book. I just wanted to say that when Suvaid Yaseen here, who sort of set up this event, got in touch with me, and the idea of bringing it under the rubric of a Kashmir-Palestine kind of thing came up, I was very, very nervous. Because, sometimes these are useful parallels, and Professor Tikriti did, I think, a remarkable job of telling us what is common and what is not. But particularly in the Indian context, it has a very interesting connotation, which is that in India, the left, and let's say the left progressives, have traditionally been very, very vehement in their position on Palestine, but totally silent on Kashmir. And this has been one of the great ironies, that the formal left in India will have rallies and processions and books and meetings and everything, but the same set of people will never speak about Kashmir. So when we talk about erasure and silencing, it's not just the state that we are talking about. We are also talking about people like us. Interestingly, in 2011, I edited a volume of writings. It's called Until My Freedom Has Come, and Suvaid, then a young student at JNU, contributed a slim chapter to that book. I subtitled the book, The New Intifada in Kashmir. And it was a provocation, because it was a book that was meant essentially for an Indian audience. And there was a lot of conversation amongst us about, is this provocation worth it? And it was, because the usual suspects, the left progressives, got very angry. Like, how dare you call this an intifada, because the intifada is a Palestinian thing. And so it worked, the provocation worked. So in that sense, the kind of link with Palestine has been deployed by me largely instrumentally, just to get up the wick of people's whose silence I was appalled by, I'm just going to maybe show some pictures, but I just wanted to say that for this presentation, I've been doing this talk in a few places, and then I have a PowerPoint called Witness October 22, and then there's one called Witness Brown October 22, because I put in a special slide in this, which is actually the first image in the book. And if you'll dip the lights, I'll go to that first image. So this is an image. It's the first image in the book. It says Srinagar 1986, Rally for Palestine, Islamic Students League, and the banner, which I don't think you can read here, says Jerusalem is calling out to Muslims. So I thought it quite appropriate that when we're trying to make that link, we remind people that people in Kashmir have actually kind of been quite passionately following what was going on in Palestine. So the book has 9 photographers. The oldest of them is Merajuddin, who literally almost sort of, invented the genre there. He was not a photographer until literally he sort of a camera and a situation kind of fell into his lap, and from being a kind of semi-employed young man, he began taking pictures. So for example, this picture from November 1989, Justice Neelkant Ganju, this is a judge who was assassinated right in the heart of Srinagar. He had given a judgment, a death sentence. He had passed a death sentence on a very important, charismatic leader of the JKLF, and so this was a kind of an assassination in response to that. This image from the anti-election campaign in Islamabad, 1989. Elections have traditionally been used in Kashmir as a means of sort of legitimizing what was an illegitimate state presence. And election boycotts have a long history, and the election turnout figures are a source of great discussion every time. So in this election campaign, this is a coffin that has been placed in the main square of the town. And in Urdu, it says many things, but it also says the first person to vote will be rewarded with this gadi. Gadi means like a car. So basically, it's a threat that if you vote, then you're going to drive off in this. This is after the Bijbehara massacre of October 1993, one in a series of infamous massacres of civilians. 54 people were killed on this occasion. The media were kept away. And this is the morning after when Merajuddin reached there. The bodies have been removed, but their footwear still lies there, and I don't know what the soldier is looking for. But what you see on the left of the frame, the light leak came because this soldier then grabbed Miraj's camera and kind of pulled the film out. And 1.5 frames survived, and in the video you'll actually see those frames. So I just wanted to put this in just to tell you what is the kind of situation under which photographers used to work then and continue to work. This, very much like a tableau, Srinagar 1993, crackdown in Ailikadal. So a crackdown, for those who may not know this, is a very frequently deployed mode of, it may have other purposes, but of terrorizing a civilian population. It involves soldiers arriving, cordoning off an area, asking everybody to leave their homes, and then they enter and search. And I don't think there's any Kashmiri who grew up in the 90s, 2000s, or even now, who doesn't somewhere carry that trauma of soldiers with boots entering homes, entering bedrooms, kind of a violation of the most personal spaces. So, and this image, the aftermath of the siege of Char-e-Sharif, 1995. So Char-e-Sharif is one of the most revered Sufi shrines in Kashmir, and built in memory of Nundrishi Sheikh Nuruddin Wali, who's kind of the patron saint of Kashmir, revered by Muslims and of course by Hindus as well. And there was a standoff between militants and soldiers here in 1995, and the shrine and the surrounding town was burnt down, and Miraj is there to make this image. So the book has about 25 to 30 photographs from each of them, but it also has, each of these sections is followed by what I call a profile. And it's really comes out of my conversations with these photographers, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but today I'm going to just read you one paragraph from each of these profiles. So Miraj says, I began to carry 2 identity cards in 2 different pockets, one in my shirt and another in my pants. In case something happened, I wanted people to know who they had found. Every day was full of such sights. At one grenade blast, I saw an elderly man rushing around helping to pick up victims tirelessly, until he turned over this one body and realized it was his own son. All of us photographers wept that day. The second photographer in the book is Javed Shah. Javed Shah, for many years, was the staff photographer for the Indian Express. You'll see immediately between Merajuddin and Javed Shah a kind of shift in the way the images are made. He began shooting events not with that kind of like a documentary clarity, but a kind of slightly more elliptical way of looking at the same thing. So this, of course, is a flower seller, a shikara on the Dal Lake. But even when he shot something like After a Fidain Attack, Srinagar 2005, you can see that he's kind of refracting the violence in order to perhaps protect his audience, perhaps protect himself. But I do remember that when I first became aware of Javed's work around in the 2000s, his work would always appear on the front pages of the Indian Express in color. And that was like always a bit of a mystery, that when reporting on Kashmir doesn't make it to the front pages, then how come photographs do? But they did. This, a dead tourist in SMHS hospital, April 2006. This, a Fedain attack at Dulgate, September 2005. And he says, Javed says, like everybody else here, I have several birthdays. Call it intuition, telepathy, whatever, but I do believe in it, because that's the only way you can survive this place. Why did I start shooting so many of those distorted reflections those days? Maybe it was to mirror the madness that had taken over our streets. It was an experiment of sorts, or a sign of my frustration at what was going on. Who can say? The third photographer is Dar Yaseen. Dar Yaseen is a Srinagar lad, as they would say. He's been a staff photographer with the Associated Press. He grew up in Srinagar. He knows the streets. He shoots the streets, and he's very much the sort of everyday photojournalist, which means when he was younger, it meant getting onto your bike every day, getting into the heart of town, and going out and shooting. And now the only difference is that he gets into a car, and then he gets into the center of town, and he puts on all his protective gear and his helmet, and he shoots. You know, it's like what you do every day. It's a job. So, but in that work, you will see that gradually he's shooting protests. He's at a certain time, probably shooting protests every day, but he's always looking for something. You know, this is the image you're seeing is Srinagar 2016. This one from 2015 called Soldier Takes Cover, or this from a protest in 2016. So there's a kind of, you can see like he's searching for, in all this craziness, he's searching for some kind of balletic forms, you know. And when I pointed this out to him, I think he was a little puzzled at why I was over-reading, you know, like, I liked it, took it, well, that's what it is, you know. Or images like this, which is called Aftermath of Gun Battle, Mairu, Srinagar 2010, which is immediately after a gun battle when soldiers had entered this home and left, and they had not only devastated the home, but they had also robbed some jewelry that belonged to the family, and so there's a distraught family trying to deal with the aftermath. Or this iconic image from Pehlipura funeral of Wasim Mullah, who was a very significant militant commander from 2016. So this is the kind of image that actually in 2016 began to travel, you know. So Yaseen actually was part of the Pulitzer Prize winning team, and his work has really appeared in all the sort of, you know, if you're a news photographer, well, then he's done it all, you know. His work has appeared everywhere. And he says, I was shooting once near the HMT factory on the outskirts of Srinagar. It was a day-long encounter with militants, and the army was keeping us far from the gun battle. When it was over and all of us photographers rushed in, I got busy, looking at the bodies, taking pictures, the usual. Suddenly, I had the feeling that the place looked oddly familiar, and stopped. When I looked around, I realized that the place I was standing in was the burnt-out shell of my old school. I was so shaken, I must have stood there for several minutes, my ears ringing, unable to move. The fourth photographer is Javed Dar. Javed is from a village some distance from Srinagar. He also works for the Chinese news agency Xinhua. In his work, you will see it's not that he is not confronting the violence, but he's also very interested very often in what's happening outside, you know. So with each of these photographers, particularly those who worked in the digital domain, you know, it meant sitting with them and running over maybe a few thousand images. And I would keep kind of tapping my way through the images and then stop sometimes. And it was quite interesting because he was completely baffled at my choices, because, I mean, he was intrigued that, like, what's the news in this picture? You know, it's a press conference. Or this one, you know, which is just an image of colored dye, which was used to spray on protesters from 2013. Or this image of a burial procession in Lower Munda, 2008. And most interestingly, this, which is a migrant worker's family, Anantnag, 2015. Now, Javed on weekends, you know, used to go down in his bike home, and he would always notice this tiny little community of migrant laborers from India, who would actually make brooms out of the stalks of rice. And he probably has shot there about 20 times. So I kept seeing in his personal archive these images of these migrant workers. And he had some kind of fascination for these people who looked so poor, and so he always stopped. And this image in particular is one of those images when I stopped and I said, what an image this is. And he was like, I mean, what's this? It's just somebody enjoying the snow. I mean, that's not it's not a great picture. But I don't know, somehow I'm very particularly fond of this. And of course, this image called After the Fire, Frisland, 2012, It's again an image that traveled everywhere and, figured in all the big magazines. It's been on several book covers. And Javed says, I can remember the day the first crackdown happened in our village. I had just finished my metric exam. It was June 9, 1992. The army arrived early in the morning and they came in trucks, so we knew that this was not going to be routine. We were meant to start planting paddy that day and had left the house early. The first day of planting is a sort of festival in Kashmir. We were stopped by the soldiers as we walked to the far end of the village and told to go back home. My father tried to argue, but they said no. Boys like him are the terrorists. Now, in the account that I have in the book, which continues from this point, Javed was then taken and waterboarded. But in his description, it was not his waterboarding that hurt him or humiliated him. He could, in the next room, hear his school teacher being waterboarded. And he says that I honestly, I didn't feel anything myself, but the humiliation that my school teacher is being humiliated in the next room was unbearable. And then something quite miraculous happens as the soldiers take them out and Javed is being put into the back of a truck along with his school teacher. The women of the village arrived and just grabbed these boys and literally wrested them back. Now, this is not something that's likely to happen now, and it was a miracle that it happened even then. But, he owes probably his life to the fact that a group of women in the village displayed some mad, extraordinary courage and managed to pull these boys out. The fifth photographer is Altaf Qadri. Altaf also is a photographer with the Associated Press now. He's a very accomplished photographer. This image, aftermath of grenade attack 2006. Altaf is also somebody who is unable to just stay with what he sees in his viewfinder. So his stories, his engagements are always he's very engaged with what's happening. And this is not just in Kashmir. I know that he's been working out of Delhi for many years, and he'll do a feature on a little school run under a flyover for migrant labor, and eventually he'll end up raising money for them. And he's for him the image making is very important, but he's always engaging with the outside world. This image called Injured Shopkeeper, Srinagar 2008, aftermath of a militant attack, Srinagar 2006, funeral of Ruhaullah Bhatt, who was a militant commander, Avalura, February 2008, and funeral of 3 militants in Crewe 2005. Now, I just want to point out that all the photographers have literally hundreds of pictures of funerals. And that is because in these years, and that has changed now after 2019, funerals used to be the one time when all bets were off, which is that because 5, 10, 15,000 people may gather, the security forces would pull back, the army would pull back, the BSF would pull back, the police would pull back for that half day. And then you could really see the rage within people. So I filmed one such funeral, which is there in my film, and it's just unbelievable what goes on there. And we can talk about it later, but it's not surprising that since 2019, funerals are forbidden in Kashmir. And bodies are not returned even to families. They're buried at 150 kilometers from their home in order to just cut off that kind of high emotion. And Altaf says, a man had been blown up while defusing an improvised explosive device in Palhalan village. At least that's what the newspapers in Srinagar had reported. Later that morning, when we photographers got there, the people of the village were so angry, they were ready to lynch us. We ended up being chased through the village for almost 300 meters before a conversation could even be started. You only carry the army version, the furious young men said to us. Whatever they say matters, what we say never gets reported. It usually takes a lot of persuasion by the buzurg, the village elders, to restore the balance. Still, I always like to talk and never give up without arguing for what I believe in. Whether I end up getting slapped up or beaten, no issue, that's part of it. So this getting slapped up and beaten is very much part. Of course, it is a very masculine, very macho culture, as photojournalism tends to be globally. But because the photojournalist is often the first person, kind of literally the first responder to a crisis, to a killing, to a massacre, they also sort of absorb the first rage, you know. So it doesn't, at that time, they know these are local boys, they know them, but, you know, this rage that, okay, you've come, but you're going to lie about what's happened, you know, which is what he's talking about here. So getting slapped up, beaten is like, it's very much part of the game for these photographers, has been. The sixth photographer is Sumit Dayal. Sumit is, in this kind of chronology, the first photographer who's properly trained in photography. So Shumit's family are from the Pahari, the mountainous part of the Kashmir Valley, from Rajouri. And Shumit, you know, they're Kashmiri, his parents are Kashmiri speakers, but he grew up in Kathmandu. He trained at the International Center for Photography in New York and then became a very, very accomplished assignment photographer. You know, he's got half a dozen Time magazine covers, including the first Time cover with Narendra Modi on it. So he was really like a top-notch photojournalist. And then, I'm not quite sure what, but he decided to go back to Kashmir and kind of delve into that, his roots. But he did a very interesting thing. He left behind his old gear and he bought himself 3 very basic Russian cameras and black and white film. And I think one of the cameras was a panoramic camera, and proceeded to go back and shoot many of the things that the other photojournalists did, but shooting it in black and white and on film. So like this, for example, an image at Hazrat Bal Shrine, Srinagar. This portrait of a woman. Now, you see, when you shoot on film in the old-fashioned cameras, you can always rewind and do a double exposure, you know. So he started doing some of these in-camera things that you can do with film and, you know, have very unexpected results, unlike, you know, contemporary digital photography, or constructing, you know. Wow, how come this is already showing here? Yes. So, you know, this is called Winter Life 2009-2010, which is a kind of composite made from a set of images. But eventually he said, look, there are too many images. I don't want to produce more images. I want to look at, you know, found material, his own family's archives, you know. And he's actually done some beautiful work with found images, which have been displayed in kind of very good art spaces as well. And then sometimes something like this, you know, which is an image he has taken in 2011, but it's kind of juxtaposed with the back of a photograph taken by his grandfather. And it says, "Wish you live long, best wishes, S. Dayal." And his comment to this is, "We don't know who it was meant for, but it has found me." And Sumit says, "I'm not done with my work in Kashmir. I'm not done with all that. When I go back, I'll do something that a large number of people will understand. I need to pull myself back from a level of abstraction and take the work to some other level," he said. In the tales of ghosts who want to be set free, what holds them back is memory, Sumit had written some years ago. There is a certain grip about my childhood memories from Kashmir and a past I must unfold to know who I am. It is here at home that I searched for the experience of being in a space where, and here Sumit Dayal cut himself short and turned to T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. The 7th photographer in the book is Shaukat Danda. Shaukat is an exceptional photographer, but what I'm particularly very fascinated about him is that he's from Baramulla, which is a small town in North Kashmir. He went to school and college there, and for 2 years he came to the US to study photojournalism at I think the University of Missouri, but went right back home, continues to live in Baramulla, Even Srinagar is not a temptation. The largest city in the Kashmir Valley is not a temptation for him. Most of his photographic work is done within, I would say, 30 kilometers of Baramulla. But he continues to produce exceptional work. And this is an image from 2008 called Protesting Women, Langate. This from the 2010 massive protest that happened in 2010 in Srinagar. And this from a series of portraits he did of young men on the run. Now, what do I mean by that? After the protests started, almost all the young men who took part in the protests were marked off by the police. And so they couldn't stay home during the day, and they would hide in, all around. And this image, for example, this is called Saqib from 2014. And Saqib and his friends used to hide in this graveyard, or this called Ishfaq, where Ishfaq and his friends were hiding in an abandoned public health center. Or this called Zahin, which is also, I think, an abandoned school. And quite astonishingly, this photo series was actually carried by the Washington Post. And I've often been asked by people that, does this not kind of make it dangerous for those young people, to have these photographs taken? And actually, it's quite the opposite, because all of them were very relieved that their images had appeared in the Washington Post, because now they couldn't be made to disappear, So there's a kind of odd sort of logic to this thought. And Shaukat says, at some point, this is the shift of voices because I've just kept the text exactly like it's in the book. At some point during our conversation, we found ourselves stopping in the middle of Cement Bridge. On a December afternoon in 1989, it was the site of a massive public celebration, a spontaneous outburst after 5 Kashmiri militants were released from prison. The next day, on the back foot and still seething, the police opened fire on an innocuous protest near the bridge. Some thought of it as a targeted killing, a lesson to the boisterous town. One of those killed was a teenager, Parvez, Shaukat's cousin. A few months later, in March 1990, Shaukat's older brother, Sajjad, quietly slipped away from home. Only 16 at the time, Sajjad had joined the newly emerged Students' Liberation Front, and like thousands of other young men in Kashmir who went looking for training in handling arms, he crossed over the line of control to Pakistan-controlled Kashmir. The tragic footnote is that young Sajjad didn't even make it all the way across. He didn't even reach the camp. He was killed just short of making that crossing. The 8th photographer is Syed Shahryar, a very young, very good photographer. And this image, which I always share when we are announcing these talks, is quite interesting. It's actually, it's a police announcement about polio vaccine. And you'd wonder why the police need to be announcing polio vaccine. It's because there was a rumor that the government was trying to poison everybody through the polio vaccine. So the government had to send around police cars to tell people, no. So it just gives you an indication of the kind of lack of trust. But Shahryar is also from the Shia minority in Kashmir. And traditionally, the Shias have been a kind of impoverished minority, and he is really very passionate about documenting aspects of Shia culture, speaking about it, drawing attention to it. So these are a series of images that he has made in 2015. This one from Muharram in Hassanabad. This from made during Muharram, but at the Langarbagh Garden in 2015, and this from the Imam Bargah in Zadibal in Srinagar also in 2015. And finally, this image, which is probably the last, chronologically the last image in the book. It's from the funeral of Burhan Wani in Tral. Burhan Wani was a young, very charismatic militant commander who was one of the first people who started sort of unmasking himself, and the militancy had largely been underground and not visible, but he would photograph him, allowed himself to be photographed, and he was a very good-looking young man and became a huge thing. And I think even in India, it's not just Kashmiris, but even in India, the way that those images traveled, it did caused people to think a little, I mean, like, okay, so this is what these guys are, because people hadn't seen who they were. So his killing in 2016, and there were huge protests, of course, but for example, you can see the number of people gathered here. I think the government sort of taking note of the importance of funerals and the crackdown on funerals had sort of already begun with this one. And Syed Shahryar says, till a few years ago, we tried to position ourselves on the side of the protesters. It gave us a very different perspective on their battles with the paramilitary. But that changed completely after 2013. It's become too dangerous for the photographers. Pellet guns are everything for the police now. I don't understand it. They seem to love these pellet guns. It's like a narcotic for them. Sometimes at a protest, they shoot people in the leg, even when the stone throwing is not too heavy, just so that they can identify them later, a sort of tag. And the last photographer in the book is Azan Shah, who I can only describe as absurdly young. He was not even 20 when the book came out. And Azan is properly a young man who has grown up, I mean, not just in the Troubles, but, you know, sort of smack in the middle of them. And he is a photographer. He sees himself as a photographer, but not a photographer of photojournalistic images, but a photographer of the street, you know. So this image called Fateh Ka Dil, Srinagar 2015, but he has a series of images which he has taken in downtown Srinagar. And it's quite interesting when we sat down to eventually caption these pictures. He insisted that they just be, this one is called Road to Zaina Kadal, 2015. This is also Road to Zaina Kadal, and this is called Road from Barbar Shah to Habba Kadal. So for him, I mean, there is nothing else. It's just, it's a way, I'm going to call it that. And when he does shoot something which is kind of more newsy, this one is called Friday Protest, Bohri Kadal 2015. Well, then you can see he's at the periphery. He's not interested necessarily in the stone throwing, but in something, he's looking for something else. And in this very sweet conversation that he had with me, he says, you have to accept what is around you and then try and make pictures. That's what I try to do. But you have to start in the morning because things get messy in the day. Would I like to be invisible? Well, I've been taking a lot of pictures on my smartphone recently. It's made me realize the beauty of imperfection in photography. Sharpness is overrated, and I don't like photos that are too sharp or too perfect in terms of dynamic range. Nor do I like photos that are cropped perfectly. Real life and the streets are not perfect. It's the imperfect edges of a photograph that give it realness. So that's the book. And I'm going to show you this 4-minute video to just kind of walk you through the... Can we have the lights? Actually, I just wanted to say that in some ways, when this book came out in 2017, not because of the book, obviously, but something very sort of almost magical was happening with these photographers, and there was a lot of attention. And soon after that, Yaseen got the Pulitzer. Many of the other photographers, they were getting featured in all the. So it was a kind of quite exciting time, suddenly there was such a thing known as photography in Kashmir, which was very interesting because actually we don't have a tradition of photography. We don't have a school of photography. We don't have an art school that teaches photography. And if there was a tradition of photography in Kashmir up until 1952, it was a properly kind of colonial photography, and if you look at those collections, there are hardly any human beings in it. And of course, after 1952 and the underlying the tensions over Kashmir, the evocation always was of these simple and happy people, and it was all part of sort of propaganda photography, sort of a neo-colonial photography. So there wasn't really a tradition, and it was quite magical that suddenly there was so much work and so much talk around it. The book got reviewed very extensively in India, and suddenly there was a kind of a buzz around it, And 2019, which a reference was made by Professor Tikriti also, when what is called Article 370 was written down, which was a sort of a special set of constitutional protections that the state of Jammu and Kashmir had. They were removed by highly contentious, highly unconstitutional means. And of course, not surprisingly, the Supreme Court of India has not heard that matter even 3 years later. But it was also accompanied by a very kind of severe crackdown. And you referred to that in terms of the sort of the blockage of the internet, which is which got some attention internationally. Probably the longest internet shutdown in the world of over 9 months. But well before that, for 3 months, there were no phones. Mobile telephony was stopped for 6 months, and so on. So it was a very severe crackdown. But somehow in that period, once again, photographers and journalists managed to do an exceptional job of getting the story out, And perhaps this was the one thing that the government hadn't anticipated, that people would, shoot pictures, write stories, put them on sticks, go to the airport, find somebody going to Delhi, or get onto the plane sometimes and get to Delhi. And so the information kept coming out, much to I think it must have infuriated the state when they had blocked everything, no street protests, no funerals, no nothing, and arrested everybody. Thousands of people were arrested, but news was going out. And I don't know if many of you might not know this, but foreign correspondents can't visit Kashmir without permission, which means you won't get permission, so you don't go. So all the international media was getting its news from very young freelancers on the ground. And so very soon there began a kind of very systematic, first the local media, which was very vibrant and quite an interesting media scene, was completely hobbled, and almost it's become like nothing. No one reads those publications anymore. And I'm talking about like half a dozen newspapers in the English language and Urdu and so on. But then the systematic kind of, literally hunting down of these journalists began and continues to this day. But somewhere in the middle of this, in this cusp between when this book was kind of a little bit coming out of itself, in India, it started finding an entry into spaces that it hadn't been intended for, which was the kind of art space, And I myself have a lifelong kind of skepticism about that space. But I was quite happy because, if the Serendipity Art Festival in Goa wants to put 2 copies of Witness on a book and a few thousand people walk through it every day and flip through it, I'm like, good, it sounds fine. And as part of this, we got an invitation from the Sydney Biennale who said, will you do something for us? Not a photo show, but we want the book to be, I don't know, on the walls or whatever, you know. So I'm just going to show you a few images because to me, it's quite miraculous what can happen sometimes with a book and a project. Like, can you just dim the lights a little bit, please? Yeah, sorry, they do it from there. So yeah, so this was the announcement for what it was called Shaheed Witness Kashmir. And you recognize this image. And so, for example, this image from Mirajuddin, they invited us to select some images which were blown up pretty big, you know, like 20 foot by whatever, 8 or 9 feet. And this was the main venue called Cockatoo Island in Sydney, where you took the ferry and landed. And the first thing you saw was these images. So you see images by Shaukat, you see Shumit's image. And of course, you will wonder at the fact that they look so empty, because however wonderful it was to be invited there, the Sydney Biennale opened and then shut down 2 weeks later because of COVID. So it was heartbreak all around, but I still insist on showing these pictures just to tell you what the possibilities are. And they also gave us a space in quite a prestigious art gallery where we kind of literally exploded the book and put it up on the wall. So yeah, that was the Biennale story. And so there it is. That's the book. It was produced with the support of the Prince Claus Fund and the India Foundation for the Arts. And yeah, I'm done. I'm now, I think, Suvaid is, you.
Thank you so very much. Maybe we can have the lights.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. That was incredible. I think there's a lot there, especially around the questions of framing, that I've been trying to process this book for the last week. And that was very, very helpful. I'll now invite Suvaid Yaseen for discussant comments. We have to thank Suvaid for organizing this event, for putting this incredible group of people together. He received his PhD. He defended his dissertation in history from Brown and is currently at Mount Holyoke College. So we're very lucky to have him back for this. His dissertation project, Islamic Intersections, Religion and Politics in Kashmir in the Long 20th Century, examines Muslim reform movements, colonial modernity, and literary cultures in Kashmir in the long 20th century. His work charts intellectual histories from below and makes a case for recuperating wide-ranging forms of political imagination and modalities of religious thought, trans-regional movements, and local politics. And he'll be sharing his thoughts on Witness with us today.
Thank you, Zehra, for the introduction. Just a moment. I am trying to set up a slide.
Yeah. Yeah.
You are here.
Yeah.
I'll just... Okay, again, thank you for the introduction and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back here at Brown. Sounds a bit strange to say back, but nevertheless. I'm especially glad that I'm here for a conversation about archives of the present, thinking with Kashmir and Palestine together, contexts which push us to interrogate deeply the questions of archive, of examining contentious histories, and immediacy of such conceptual labor, an example of which we just saw. But before I begin my comments, and they will be brief, I do want to take a quick moment to thank the now Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia for having Sanjay over to speak with us. And thank you, Sanjay, for coming. I also want to thank Abed for joining all the way from London. We had to figure it out, but glad that he made it at the end. I also want to especially thank Faiz Ahmed for his support. Also, Wazira Zamindar, she's not here, but she helped think about the event. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well. Zehra, Hashmi for moderating the event. And of course, Stephanie and Grace, hopefully they're listening or they will listen later, for making this event possible in the first place. And thank you to everyone for coming on a Friday afternoon. Moving on, we have already listened to Abed and Sanjay in some detail, and I do not want to repeat what has already been said. Instead, I want to use this opportunity to employ Witness, Sanjay's text, as well as an archive, to think about the significance of the archives of present for narrating the history in and of a place like Kashmir. What are the stakes and specificity of such a project? Is it simply about challenges of working in and around a militarized context, as we saw in Sanjay's presentation? I also want to think about how such archives take a life of their own, as was referred to. What enables us to see them, listen to them, think with them? Or perhaps more importantly, what makes us not to see them, not to think or not to listen with them? So what makes them visible and what also makes them invisible? In doing so, I want to consider two things. Firstly, to examine witness as an invitation to do more, to witness further, so to speak. Of course, the title comes from the word shaheed, which refers to both the act of witnessing and to the martyrs who die in a cause. Kashmir provides both in abundance. Secondly, I want to think with concepts of forgetting and abandonment, which the work raises at the very beginning with a John Berger quote, and I'll come to that in a bit. In examining witness as an invitation to do more, I do want to foreground Sanjay's longer engagement with Kashmir through his work, particularly his 2007 documentary, Jashn-e-Azadi, whose English title was How We Celebrate Freedom, little different from its literal meaning. I'm not exactly sure, I don't remember when I exactly saw it, but I do remember inviting Sanjay long back to my college in Delhi University. This was right after saying a hello at LTG Auditorium. I'm sure he has no recollection of this important event in my life. But he did accept the invite. And the day the screening was to happen at our college, the principal's office got a call in the morning asking the screening to be cancelled. The caller argued that it might hurt sentiments. But those were different days in Delhi. Teachers could be more supportive. They still are, but it's not always possible. College also did not care. The principal's office did not care. The screening happened. There was a long discussion until dusk. But more the film became known, the more difficult it became to screen it in later years in India. So I remember quite a number of protests. And I also remember screenings when they were not advertised. Yeah. But even as while it continued hurting sentiments in Indian spaces, Jashn-e-Azadi was well received in Kashmir. At the film's first public screening in Srinagar, I was not there, but I heard stories. Sections of audience erupted in slogans for Azadi freedom, even as some more academically minded people would later express the sentiment that such sloganeering was inappropriate for the occasion. I think Sanjay did not mind it at all, or maybe he did. But even as the film was largely well received, there seemed to be no uniform opinion about it, what it was trying to highlight or what it was not trying to highlight. At +2 hours, Jashn-e-Azadi is a hard watch as it moves from place to place, from streets of Srinagar to slogans at the funerals of fallen rebels in the mountains, from the glee and disappointment of Indian tourists visiting Valley to people burying bodies far away from the city. From a state-sponsored conflict resolution workshop to the outpatient department of city's largest mental health hospital. There are too many restless threads to the visualization of celebration of Kashmiri freedom, Jashn-e-Azadi. Nevertheless, a consensus remained that it was a significant text, a grim visual introduction to Kashmir's recent past, a meditation about various aspects of Kashmiri struggle that showed footage which would never really make it to the Indian news channels, for example. But most importantly, and this is where lay the satisfaction of engaging with the film, that it was an invitation for a deeper dive into corridors of region's history. I'm not sure if a sequel to Jashn-e-Azadi might be possible, and Sanjay might have to say more on that, but Witness does carry forward the same invitation. Like the film, the book, as you can see, is voluminous, but at the same time, it also makes you seek more, both of the archive and the history it tells. The question that animates such a desire, as Sanjay notes in his introduction, is, and I quote, if there had been 200,000 armed militants waging war in those early years, the early 1990s in Kashmir, for instance, riding on a wave of popular support, how was it that only a few short years later they had all disappeared, leaving little visible trace beside the several hundred Mazar-e-Shuhada martyrs' graveyards that dot the countryside, end quote. I did mean to ask about the figure of 200,000 armed militants, but the point remains. Where do we begin to look for traces of Kashmir's past? How and where might we access it? Part of the answer to that question is the book itself. Photographs collected and printed in a volume do preserve much of it. Yet witness alerts us to many traces, also alerts us to many traces that were lost. In the very first story about veteran photographer Mehrajuddin, Sanjay referred to him as well, the text notes how the pressure of deadlines in a different era in the 1980s meant that many negatives were simply trashed. Valuable histories have simply disappeared with those outtakes, Sanjay writes in the introduction. In another instance, the 2 boxes of negatives that Mehraj had saved from his work were almost destroyed in the 2014 floods that enveloped large portions of Srinagar city for weeks. As such, Kashmiri photographers and journalists' personal journeys and the context of their work were getting beaten up is a sort of baptism of sorts. Welcome to the profession, highlights the immediacy of bearing witness in Kashmir, of course, among so many other things. This has only been heightened in the more recent years, where no proper reportage, leave aside critical, has been possible. Journalists, human rights activists, civil society activists languish in jails, not to speak of political leaders and activists. In terms of content, old news items and articles are suddenly disappearing from websites and suddenly appearing when they are to be used against someone for making a case to send them to prison. Also, what's published as opinion in local newspapers, I'm not sure if you check newspapers from Kashmir these days, sometimes for fun maybe, but they used to maintain, at least say before 2019, they used to maintain some level of professional dignity. But these days they read like badly written press notes from the military, if I can call it that. But thinking more with the possibilities, let me turn to my second point. The book opens with a quote from John Berger, who writes, "What is remembered has been saved from nothingness. What is forgotten has been abandoned." In response to this reminder, from Berger follows witness. Works like this then salvage such a situation by remembering, not forgetting, not abandoning, by becoming the archive. Such an archive not only retrieves the difficult histories of Kashmir's recent past, killings, human rights violations, and so on, but also points to the embeddedness of the Kashmiri struggle within a global imagination for justice. So if you look at this first picture here, which is also the first picture from the book, it's from a rally for Palestine from 1986. The armed struggle had not yet begun. There's a banner in the background which declares, "There's no God but God." There's another placard which says, "Jerusalem is calling out to Muslims." So in a sense, it's an image from 1986 Kashmir, but also a very global image in a way. Some of the people in the picture, more precisely Ashfaq Majid Wani, Yaseen Malik, Javed Mir, would shortly be at the forefront of the armed struggle as commanders of the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front that called for independence of the region from both India and Pakistan. In the sympathetic readings of this Kashmir's armed movement, such a vision, independence from both, was seen as a secular projection or a secular vision. Yeah? Now the next picture in the volume, which follows immediately. Yeah. So the next picture from the volume is of Muhammad Yusuf Shah, dressed in a white shroud, as he campaigned for the infamous 1987 elections in Kashmir to give democratic process a chance. What would have been a certain victory ended up in electoral loss and imprisonment. including of young men in the first picture who campaigned for him and afterwards fought for an independent Kashmir. Shah himself emerged as Sayyid Salahuddin to head Kashmir's largest rebel group, Hizbul Mujahideen, and demanding accession with Pakistan. His vision was seen as not secular, not religious, or in other terms, Islamist. But Kashmir's history remains complicated. Its imaginaries of resistance often crisscross the bounds of secular and religious, local and global, connect its desire for freedom to similar struggles in far-off lands. An overemphasis on political positions derived from internalization of the nation-state as the dominant legible mode of analysis, with the consequence that demand for one's own nation is seen as more palatable because it's seen as the secular option, and the desire to join another country as the wrong choice because it's seen as the religious option, obfuscates the archive more than it explains. In contrast, the archive in Kashmir pushes us to contend with complexities and think through the limitations of concepts. But continuing with Berger, however, I also want to think about that which is not forgotten, but nevertheless remains inaccessible. In Witness, Sanjay tells us about conversations during period of his research for Jashn-e-Azadi. I quote, "Looking to make sense of the early 1990s, when Kashmir first exploded in an armed insurgency, my conversations with Kashmiris frequently trailed off into almost amnesiac lapses and eventually silence. When people did remember, words seemed inadequate, tool for talking about memories, and the texture of lived experiences remained inaccessible." End of quote. I wonder, though, if such amnesiac lapses at times are deliberate. In such an instance, the silence implies a refusal to recount what could be said under different circumstances. There is something to the apparent forgetting which is not an abandonment, but merely a refusal to say out loud what is actually remembered, not forgotten, not abandoned. Of course, this is partly on account of instrumental reasons, which in a space like Kashmir often means survival. Speaking comes at a cost, as we are reminded time and again. In the Kashmir of 1990s, after the armed rebellion started, the Indian military would often raid houses and localities during what was called crackdown. Sanjay mentioned it as well, looking for rebel hideouts or arms and ammunition, but also so-called incriminating materials, books, pamphlets, pictures, video cassettes, audio cassettes with songs. It continues even now with some additions. Stopping and searching passers-by on roads, the military often looks into their mobile phones. Whose pictures are stored? Which apps are used? What people are posting on social media, so on and so forth. Like in the 1990s, when people destroyed, burned, buried copies of books, cassettes, tapes, which they thought might get them into trouble, people nowadays delete their pictures, conversations, just in case. But I want to leave this question open. Is there more to such deliberate burial than mere instrumentality of safety and survival? People do sometimes want to forget, delete, censor. But that does not imply abandonment. In such a case, in place of the archive, its destruction is remembered, howsoever ironic. Yet the very moment of destruction, the road towards forgetting, also remains an act of intimate witness. What was lost into silence was perhaps not to be shared, not accessible to everyone, not just yet, while the occupation continues. As if arguing that forgetting, amnesia, is mere waiting, not abandonment, something which might explain the last few years in Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you, Suvaid. Sanjay, would you like to respond to Suvaid and actually Abed's points if they're still present for you, and then we can open it up for discussion?
No, just to say that I'm profoundly moved by his observations, and sort of my own understanding of the work gets, embellished which you can't ask for more. So I hope he'll email me this text sometime and let me read it carefully. No, I can't agree with him more. I think we know that, when I referred to this coming up against these silences, I was doing it with all the crude impulses of a filmmaker, who says it doesn't matter what's in your head, why don't you put it on tape, So there was that's a different impulse. But I totally understand what he's saying, and why, one of the things that struck me when I'm a Kashmiri by birth. I spent probably every summer on vacation, but I didn't grow up in Kashmir, and I properly returned in 2003. When after a very long gap, after 14 years I was visiting. And one of the things I was very struck in my conversations with people was how many dates people remembered. This was news to me, like it's not just 1932 or 1947, but people would remember in the year who was killed when, which massacre happened. And I find that now, so many years later, almost 20 years later, I've become a bit like that, Like I also remember those dates. So I think that Suvaid is absolutely right that, it's a silence, it's not an abandonment. Mm-hmm. And earlier in the conversation, I referred to the fact that when I was looking for material in the 90s, I was looking at photographs, but I found video. I made it seem very pat. But actually, that search for video was very fascinating because, I must have spent 6 months visiting people and asking about it. And every once in a while, I met somebody who said, yeah, there's material, don't worry, there's material. But the material never came. I was always almost there, and then I wasn't. And there was almost there. And, by then, I was, by the standards of Srinagar, fairly well connected, I knew many young men like Suvaid in Srinagar. So it's not that I didn't know my way around, but it was just not coming. And then one day I returned home, and I have the privilege that one of my aunts continues to have a home in Srinagar, so I live at home, so to speak. I came back to find a plastic bag with 10 VHS cassettes left there by somebody. And they were jammed solid, like it had a kind of fungus, because they'd obviously been stored in an attic or someplace and never pulled out. And I took these back to Delhi, and fortunately VHS was a very robust format. So with a screwdriver, we opened each VHS tape. We set up a muslin cloth and manually wiped the VHS tape with, with an assistant kind of spooling it back, put it back into the machine and assumed that it's going to play only once because it's so fragile, and digitized it. It was the collection of one person, right? I don't know who it is. And the film carries a dedication to the anonymous Kashmiri cameraman whose work we carried. And it was astonishing because there was coverage of, massacres, dead bodies at the police control room, access to militant training camps, amazing material. But nobody ever claimed it. So I thought once I use it, someday somebody will come up to me and say, hey, guess what? I shot that. But it's been 15 years. Wow. And nobody has claimed that. Now, and yet, nobody came to me and said, how dare you use that material? It's my material, if you know what I mean, It was like, I don't know what it was, but so when other people have asked me for that use of that material, I always refuse. Not because I'm being a, dog in the manger, but because whoever it was gave it to me in trust. I can't share it with anybody, So I think, and Suvaid made a reference which I think is the most chilling thing for me, which is that systematically the archives around Kashmir are being digitally removed. The one thing that Kashmiri media did was to simply report. So, if you wanted to cross-reference something that was happening here, you could always find something in Greater Kashmir or whatever. But now it's getting to a point where if something had made it to the New York Times or to India Today, you'll still find it, and we don't know for how long. But all the other links are broken, you know. So in a sense, 10 years from now, somebody could turn around and say, there was no massacre in Bijbehara. That's just a picture of a soldier and slippers, you know. Where's the evidence for it? Prove it, you know. Just like today, the massacre in Gujarat in 2002, we are being told that, but this is all made up, you know. This never happened, you know. And people who claim otherwise are being sent to prison, you know. So to me, this is, so in this book, I also published a second book by an Australian artist called Alana Hunt. And it so happened that her pieces were carried in a Kashmiri newspaper called Kashmir Reader. And so we used pages from Kashmir Reader in this. And if you flip through the book, you would come away thinking that how courageous are Kashmiri newspapers, because they were like free and fearless and out there with their... But this newspaper now has buckled completely. You will not be able to access any of this material anymore. So in some weird way, just, what are they called, crops from newspaper pages in this book by an Australian artist on Kashmir becomes a kind of, you know, a vehicle of record in a sense, you know. So it is, you know, and it, I mean, Suvaid put it very eloquently and in properly scholarly ways, but this is not an academic conversation, you know. This is a life and a question of life and memory, you know. And I feel that if witness, even just as that, you know, provokes a conversation around all of that, then I think it would have done its job. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll invite everyone else to jump in with their questions and comments. Perhaps you can introduce yourself really briefly, just your name and affiliation, as you ask questions. Prerna?
Hi, thank you for this book. I've had this book for many years in my living room and kind of return to it periodically, and it's really so powerful, and it's great to see the images kind of up along with your kind of narrative around it. And thanks, Suvaid, for putting this together, and it's great. I sometimes even forget that you've gone, so it's weird to hear you say back. You know, my question was really just more like kind of inviting you to speak a little bit more about, you know, you mentioned that some of these images were carried in the Washington Post, and,
yes,
you know, it kind of created this kind of, you know, what happens when these images travel? And what does the traveling of these images do to the making or not making of these images back in Kashmir? And so I thought that was quite interesting that, you know, just that was one instance of it, right? And that you would imagine that if these are boys on the run, then having their pictures in the Washington Post would in some ways kind of possibly undermine that being on the run. But that idea that, you know, the recording of being on the run, and this is all about, you know, what's recorded, what's not, right? Like being recorded, but just not being recorded by the Times of India, by the Washington Post,
yes,
means that you're less likely to disappear,
yes,
right? So there's something about like you're being on the run, but the record of your being on the run prevents disappearance, right? Because it's also degrees of disappearance,
yes,
like, you know. And so I was just kind of curious if you could just talk a little bit about, you know, you spoke, and it's certainly true that the book has had this amazing life, which is great, and it's provoked all these conversations. But in some ways, how do you think the kind of publishing of the book and more generally of images from Kashmir, like how does it influence the way in which these photographers and others are making and thinking of making images back in Kashmir, especially in this new environment? Well, I'm Prerna Singh. I teach in the political science department, and my sister has a book called Har Sham Shaheen Bagh,
okay,
which is about the protests. So,
okay,
so we've been thinking about your book also in relation to that quite a bit.
See, I'm going to kind of go some distance from your question. In a sense, public protest is a spectacle. You know, it's a performance. And there is no doubt that if young men came on the streets every Friday and took on the paramilitary forces, it was not simply done because they wanted to throw rocks. It was also done because the photographers were going to be there. And those images of these often very beautiful men, in summer bare-bodied with their faces masked, throwing stones, is done because, it's a performance. You're performing counter-hegemony, and inviting the media to be there. In the same way that, for example, in my sort of early years of immersing myself in Kashmir, I was always surprised by the fact that most of the slogans were in Urdu. And if I went very close with the camera, it would be, we want freedom in English, So it was absolutely clear that they were not just, they knew that, okay, this guy, whoever he is coming right up close. So women would burst into, we want freedom, chant, we want freedom. So always in such political sort of conflicts and such situations, there's a performative dimension of it, There are images of militants posing, with wireless sets and in nice new uniforms. It's not that the photographer just happened to be there and that parade has happened because the photographer is there. So it's to show that, look, we have uniforms, we have guns, we have wireless sets, So in that sense, there is there's a relationship between those who are being photographed and the photographers, It's not always set up, but in the same way, like, documentary filmmakers have this big pretense that, we have this completely, we are fly on the wall and whatever. But of course, we all know that's nonsense, It's like you're there with your light and camera and, you've already made that compact, and probably in the first world you've signed a, agreement with whoever you're filming, So one of the rare instances in which I was actually able to go back with one of the images was that kind of crackdown, that tableau in Srinagar, where this family is, I don't know, maybe you were not here at that point. There's this family gathered in the courtyard and these soldiers are in a crackdown. So I was talking to Mirajuddin, who had taken that picture, and I said, do you remember the circumstances? And he said, yeah, of course I do, and I can take you there. So I said, let's go. So we got into his car, and we went downtown, and of course he had forgotten because so long ago. And then literally I had made a print of that photograph, and we sort of went down the alley. And you see, in Srinagar, if you go around waving a photograph of somebody, the first thing they're going to think is you're a cop. Why else would somebody come with a photograph, And then someone recognized Mirajuddin, so, a couple of people joined us. First we went to the wrong lane. Eventually we entered that courtyard. It was exactly like how it was 30 years ago. And the man at the center of the frame was called. He ran a shop nearby. And he said, oh, this little girl is now a grown woman. She has children of her own. Another boy who's standing next to me started telling me what crackdowns meant. So the picture allowed everybody to just open up suddenly, And there was this amazing, I wish, the filmmaker part of me was saying, like, this whole thing would have made a great 10-minute film, Mirajuddin rides into the center of town with an old photograph, and, what happens, And everybody had stories to tell, and, So, it's a big book, and I imagine that even today, if you took it anywhere in Srinagar, in Kashmir actually, and set it down with a bunch of people, you would get a kind of unmatched oral history, not because people recognize themselves, but they all recognize the situations, they recognize what happened, So, in that sense, I always think of it like, this is not, it's got the conceit of an archive, right? The red sort of governmentality of it, the thick cover, the thing. But to me, it's like an archive of for now, like that's how I want it to be read. And just one small detail which I should point out: at the back of the book, we have these yellow pages where we have every image in the book is organized purely chronologically. So first image of the Palestine protest and the last image of Burhan Wani's funeral, and with very detailed comments. And in some senses, if the book has an apparently innocuous character, the truly seditious part of it lies in the yellow pages, in the content of this, you know, and I hope nobody's listening. And we have certain keywords which we provided notes for. So, for example, there are keywords like disappeared. I think there are 10 keywords. Elections, counter-insurgency, crackdown. I think there's even a JKLF, Hizbul Mujahideen. So just a note on who are these people, what it was. So in some ways, whether you are a Kashmiri and interested in recovering your past, or you are not, or you're just anybody, a student at Brown, you know. I think that the idea was to provide something which was quite solid. You know, it's there. You cannot deny this, you know. We printed 1,500 copies of this book, which is a lot of copies for an art book. I'm quite delighted to tell you that I traveled to the US with 10 copies, and those are my last 10 copies. And we are possibly reprinting in December, 500 or so. So, I mean, for me, you know, the whole thing worked in that sense. Sorry, I'm not very good in answering questions directly. I always talk about what I feel like saying, but you'll forgive me.
Other questions? Okay, quite a few. Yes, maybe we'll go, sir, you first, and then in that order back. There's this creepy whirring of a camera as soon as you mentioned the... Yeah, please.
I'm Abhimanyu Singh, a former civil servant from India. I also happen to be Prerna's father visiting.
Okay.
Thank you for your very moving and pregnant presentation. Now, from this book to Kashmir Files, what would be your reaction? I haven't seen the film as a matter of protest.
So I have, and I've actually even written about it. And for those of you who don't know, Kashmir Files is a recent film which tells a very particular telling of the so-called Kashmir story, and tells it in a very grotesque way, extremely violent. But if that was not bad enough, it was a film that was hugely supported by the Indian state and political parties, you know. So it was like, it got tax rebates, it got, I mean, you know, ministers were inviting people to watch the film. Corporates were saying that they would give their employees half days leave if they came back with a stub for the ticket. So it was like a state project. I've actually written a longish commentary on that on the Al Jazeera, for Al Jazeera. And I actually, unlike most of my peers, dismissed the film, and they said they were vaguely kind of amused that I should want to waste my time with the film. But I don't believe that that was the right thing to do, because I take that film extremely seriously. Because the person who's made it has all the appearance of a buffoon, but he may well be. But in that film is a diabolic intelligence, which I'm very, very troubled by. So, for now, let me just say this, that there are some key characters in the film. One is a former bureaucrat, one is a journalist, one is a police officer. And this young man, who's very upset about what's happened to his Kashmiri Pandit family, is kind of accusing them. And in that unfolding, they actually are creating the grounds to rewrite history. Because the cop admits that we were complicit with militants. Because why? Because the politicians were complicit with militants. The journalist admits that he didn't report the truth because nobody was interested in the truth. So what happens is, tomorrow if you say the Bij Bihara massacre happened, what this film is telling you is that that's not true. It was a fabrication because journalists were involved. And if you say, but, 3,000 Kashmiri Pandits were not killed, they'll say, you're wrong, they were. but the media was complicit. Or if you say, but where are the FIRs? A FIR in India is that if a crime is committed, it's the first information report. So if you say, well, if you're saying, 2,000 people were killed, then there should be a record. They'll say, of course there's no record because the bureaucracy and the police were involved. So actually it's a pretty mind-numbing idea, because what it's saying is everything that you know is a falsification, and everything we are telling you doesn't need proof. And why doesn't it need proof? Because I, the victim, am saying this happened. And if I tell you as a victim that this happened, boy, you better believe it, because, I have the whole moral outrage attached to it. So yeah, I think the man who made that film is coming from a very different space. But all I want to say here is that I take that film very seriously, and I think it demands a serious reading. Maybe you don't want to see it in a theater and contribute to the revenues that film made, and it made huge amounts of money. So I don't know how to translate it, but just before I came, I read on the plane that the filmmaker has bought himself a flat for 163 crores, which I don't know how to translate that into dollars, but it's a hell of a lot of money. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, my name is William Lodge. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Public Health at Brown. So I was wondering kind of your process of sitting with the photographers and selecting their work. I know there was one piece of the people in the snow, right? And
Yeah.
the photographer was like, "Oh, this is not important," but to you, this had added value, right?
Yeah.
This added value to your project. So I kind of want to know your thought process in that kind of selection of photographs.
So in some ways, maybe it's because that's the only sort of skill I have. I have a documentary filmmaker's skills. So I literally approach this like I would approach a documentary film, where, you either shoot material or you have found material, and then you try to make sense of it. One thing I have to put on the table is that the photographers were astonishingly trusting of me, because I wouldn't do it. If I had pictures and some guy walked in and said, I want to see your stuff, I would say, hang on, I want to know, what's the book going to be about and all that. Maybe it helped that, I had made a film like Jashn-e-Azadi, and so kind of my credentials were known that, okay, this is that kind of a guy. So there was zero intervention from the photographers. So in many ways, if there is a narrative in this book, it's a constructed narrative. I don't want to deny that. And I'm the person who constructed that narrative. I'm the one who chooses to see Merajuddin in one way and Javed Shah in another way and Yaseen in another way. You understand, So it's not that I'm making an argument for this is how it is. No, this is how I see it. And so in that sense, I'm not going to be overly modest about the role that I've played, because I take responsibility for that. So I do remember that there was one image that Yaseen was very unhappy with, and he couldn't understand why I liked it so much. So I said to him, wait till the dummy is done, and if you don't like it, I'll drop it. So what I did is I made a near perfect dummy, and I traveled to Srinagar, and then I sat with each of the photographers separately, not in a group, and I made each of them run through the whole book, not just their section. So the moment he went through the process, by the time he came to that image, he said, acha, theek hai, keep it. So he got it, okay, so that's what the plan was. So I think that, I began by saying this is not a collaborative project, but a curatorial project. But ultimately, that was the collaboration, that all of them with, we don't want to think about it, we're just doing our job, and, we're just these hard-boiled guys, They trusted me with the material, and, I managed to do something which met their... say someone like Sumit Dayal, he's taken very seriously in the sort of arty universe. For him, it's a bit of a step down being one of 9 photographers in a book, because ideally he should have his own book or whatever it is. But he had absolutely no problems, you know. So I think that somewhere along the line, all of us, and I think of myself, I think of this book as 9+1, you know. All of us did kind of, without verbalizing it, have a sense that we were trying to do something, you know, and it worked. That's a bonus. It need not have worked. But there was a kind of shared thing where there were photographers who didn't share their work with me. And I worked so hard. I mean, it wasn't meant to be 9 photographers. There was no number. It could have been 10, 11, 12. And then some of them just didn't get it. You know, they thought, oh, I have an amazing collection, and one day I'll sell it to the MoMA. I don't know what people think. One young guy had an astonishing collection of photographs of funerals. And it would have made a stunning chapter, and I think it would make a great book. Because he, over a period of 4 years, had shot every single funeral in Kashmir. And when you do something like that, you know, if you cull the best images, there's a incredible story in that. But he drove me nuts, and I met him a dozen times, and he didn't say yes. I'm sure he's kicking himself for it later, but you know what I mean. So these are the guys who got the idea and signed up.
There was another hand. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alex Winder. I teach in Middle East Studies background. I work on Palestine. And I was curious, first of all, thank you so much. And thank you, Suvaid. I really appreciate kind of not just the images, but kind of the way these are socially situated. And in your kind of like very brief history of photography in Kashmir, I was curious about the role of studio photography and whether there are studio photographers. In particular, I mean, the Suvaid mentioned this kind of like the kind of double meaning of Shaheed, right? And of course, thinking of Palestine, where you see, I mean, also kind of thinking about Sumit Dayal's like this kind of archive, the photographs he's working with, but also kind of in Palestine, where you see kind of studio photography most kind of in public is the martyr posters, right? So I was kind of, I guess, curious as to whether studio photography is a thing in Kashmir, how it kind of fits with the photographs that you're working with and the photographers that you're describing. Is there a relationship between them? How do those photographs circulate? What is people's relationships with them, and so on?
So I did refer to this kind of tradition of colonial photography, and that is a solid block of work, right? So, for example, one of the exceptional collections of photography in India is in Delhi, which was called the Al-Qazi collection. And once the curator Rahab had invited me to just look at one such collection, and I was just appalled at those images. They were beautiful, but I said, there's nobody in them, you know, like, who are these guys? I mean, you know, and they're not like taking pictures in the 1880s, they're like, you know, whatever, 1930s, 1940s. So there was that, you know, the kind of effacement of the Kashmiri, and if they are there, they're like tiny figures, very biblical, with conical caps and blankets, and kind of, you know, some kind of Orientalist vision of what Kashmir could be. I think post 1947, and once Kashmir became embedded in the Indian imagination as this kind of paradisical landscape which Indians needed to populate, then you have a very strong tradition of the costumed photograph. You know, so you go to a garden, you go to the boat, you go anywhere, you go for a horse ride in Gulmarg. So there'll be these guys waiting. It's quite surreal because in the middle of the most beautiful garden, there'll be a hanger with 20 bejeweled costumes, you know, and you wear that, and you wear a turban, and you hold a kangdi, and then you pose. So there's a very strong tradition of that, but that's really spectacle for the tourist, you know. Now the third thing is very interesting, and I don't want to step out of what I know, but Suvaid might be able to comment on this, but there isn't such a rich tradition. Every family will have its studio photographs. Definitely men will be photographed at 20, at 40, at 60, very nicely dressed. In some families, there will be women with them, but it will be a formal photograph. If there were personal collections, and I'm not sure that there are too many people who had very extensive. Sumit Dayal's family, because it had a certain cosmopolitanism in them, you know, they were educated in Srinagar, but his dad went off to do business in Nepal. He came back. So, you know, there's a whatever. So in a certain kind of elite Kashmiri Muslim family, maybe you would find those collections. But it's not very dense, you know. Every family will have an album. But much more importantly is what Suvaid referred to earlier. It became too dangerous if you couldn't keep pictures if you had a young man who became a martyr, or, you know, it became too dangerous to keep, you know. So people destroyed albums. There are always references to, oh, those pictures, I had that picture, I had this picture, you know. For example, many of my friends have told me about getting photographed with militants as kids, you know, hearing that there are some militants here, racing off there, having a picture taken, and then having to destroy that picture at some time, including of, I mean, everybody's a kid, right? So it's not just Kashmiri Muslim kids, but Kashmiri Hindu kids getting photographed with militants and holding their guns and, you know, feeling like a charge from what was going on, rebellion, you know. But all those images were destroyed, you know. So maybe someday somebody's got a bundle somewhere in some attic which survives. But yeah, it's not been delved into. And I know that the kind of image making that you're talking about, you know, in Afghanistan, there's such a rich tradition of that. But I don't think in Kashmir we have that.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, like structurally in Palestine, the territories are somewhat separate, where the resistance is. And in Kashmir, it's like a web. The bunker is right next to your house. So you cannot really create a studio which everyone knows makes martyr posters or something. But there had been a rich tradition in the 90s, but as was said, it's hard to access. Of late, in post-2010s, it mostly circulated through social media, but then that also kind of gives your location and so on and so forth. Now it has still, again, become sort of more underground. But it's kind of there, but not at the scale of Palestine, because they seem to have like proper departments for post-production and stuff.
Other questions? Can I take my privilege as moderator to ask a question?
Please, please.
Yes? Okay, with consensus. So thank you so much for this. This has I've been going through it throughout the week and having to take pauses as well. It's an incredibly beautiful book. You know, selfishly, I work on identification technologies and surveillance. So some of my questions were around that. And at the very beginning, I think with Mirajuddin, when he talks about keeping 2 identity cards on him. Yeah. But there's this sort of tension I felt between, including your response and Suvaid's response just now to Alex, that there's this tension between wanting to be identified, wanting to be recognized, not wanting to be lost in this. The 2 ID cards, the photography, etc. But then there's also, of course, the way that surveillance operates. And I think there's a beautiful photograph that you also showed where all the cameras are out with the polio vaccine. And you talk, I think, explicitly in that moment about that relationship between photography and surveillance, of how on one hand, being photographed and photographing is a way of responding to the surveillance regime, but how it can also be used by it. So I was just wondering, what is that dynamic? That's part A of the question. And then the second one is a little more abstract, unfortunately. I don't quite have the words for it, but it's about, this, the relationship in the images between movement and stillness. Yeah. So there's a lot of action with the jumping, and then it goes to stillness with even dead bodies. And I think Azan Shah is, I have to say, I think he's one of my favorites in there. And he has this beautiful line that I want to read, that my focus is on people. I think of them as the underexplored people of Kashmir, leading low-key lives, living them with a lot of patience. And I think there's that sense of patience that and waiting that Suvaid brought up, that coexists with the movement and the rebellion and the insurgency. And I was wondering whether there was, in your curation of it, whether there was a deliberate attempt to kind of showcase that, both of those things.
You see, I keep referring to the fact that I'm actually I'm mostly a documentary filmmaker, and I think that certainly played a role even in this final selection of the 9 photographers. It's like, to me, they're like sequences, if you know what I mean. This thing stands in for this. And then within that structure, like if you have a sequence, and there are an infinite number of ways in which you will combine those pictures. And then the designers played a very big role in sometimes pushing the limits of what I thought was possible, in terms of sometimes breaking up images. Altaf Qadri has this very dramatic picture of, aftermath of an attack on Mehbooba Mufti's thing. But, they've broken it up and sort of magnified sections. Sometimes it's, crudely cinematic, in terms of showing you a close-up and then pulling back, or the fact that actually I have to apologize, some of the images here are quite disturbing, and when I come to the US, I suddenly become conscious of the fact that there is a kind of decorum about showing terrible images in public, and which I am a little late to, and this is the 4th such event I've done. But in the book, those disturbing images are usually within fold-outs.
Right.
So the idea is that should you flip it over and you're not comfortable, you just turn it back. It's like that. So there is so both that engagement with violence, or a pause, or some choosing a set of pictures which kind of slows you down. There is a pronounced, for me, a physical dimension to it. So one has tried to play with that, and I'm glad that it's coming through. Your first question, just remind me.
It was about actually the wanting to be seen, and that relationship with surveillance and recognition.
Yeah. So I think this is Burhan Wani is a great example. He was a militant commander. There were even this kind of rumor that, he's never actually gone into combat. But it didn't matter. He became the single most influential figure because he was able to give what was until then an underground, faceless, shadowy militancy a face, And there's this very famous picture of 8 militants posing for a very nice picture, in a group. It's like a group photograph. And eventually the state hunted them down one by one, and they would then pull out that picture, saying 3 left, 2 left, 1 left. Because they understood that in that composite picture, there's a threat, And so Burhan could not have been unaware of the fact that he was exposing himself also meant that he was making himself vulnerable. Because now people knew what he looked like. He couldn't walk the streets anymore. But on the other hand, what he did, and then you see that picture of his funeral. Actually, I was in Kashmir those days, and it was like the end of the world when he was killed. Even middle-class people in Srinagar wept. And it was extraordinary because it was mostly constructed around his images. It was not like he had led some militant group for 10 years and been... No. It was that he had understood what an image can do and what kind of meaning it can have, So now, there was that phase when, what was the name of the AMU student who was killed, the geography PhD? Manan Wani. So Manan Wani was a PhD student at the Aligarh Muslim University and became a militant and issued a kind of statement. I know that it flew around the world. I know people, not Indians, not Kashmiris, but Americans, who wrote to me saying, is it okay to teach this in class? Because it was such a coherent argument for what he stood for, the secularism versus Islamist debate, all kinds of things. So social media actually, and the state was very quick to recognize that it was allowing Kashmiris an articulation, both visual and in text, which was out of control. So they went after it, and it's absolutely right. I mean, the first thing that will happen when a paramilitary trooper stops you is that you'll ask for your phone. And of course, there's no question of refusing to tell them the password, you know. So he'll go through it, and of course he'll ask you to delete it. That's the least of it. But you could also get very badly beaten up if you have something which kind of even vaguely seems to be supportive of the resistance, not just of the armed resistance, but of any kind of resistance.
Thank you. I think we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us, and please let's thank Sanjay and Suvaid. Yes.
So, one thing, I have a couple of copies of both these books, and I love to say that they're giving a fantastic discount